Bentley here, good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to our second season of the Climate of Change, our now monthly live cast exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what these wildly unprecedented times mean for addressing the climate crisis here in Alberta and how to create the impactful change we need. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqtsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I'd like to make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that may have a stake in this land that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time, specifically as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. For those of you watching tonight via Facebook Live or on the Zoomcast, please feel free to post your questions for our guest. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Should you wish me not to say your name, please type the word anonymous before your question, as this show will be shared to our social networks. Otherwise, we will assume your consent in the use of your name in the broadcast. Tonight's guest is Amber Bennett of the Alberta Narratives Project, a groundbreaking initiative involving a widely diverse range of stakeholders, from business leaders to oil and gas workers to environmentalists and to youth and to you name it, exploring how best to have meaningful conversation on climate change in a province that can often seem dead set against it. Amber Bennett, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
That's great. Okay, so I went over the Alberta Narratives project, the download, and read through the PDF. That should be available in our chat very soon. So if any of our guests want to go and check it out, I'm struck that it was released in September 2018 and then I think February 2019. And I was just thinking about how many different things have changed for us since that time, and changed for a province that's mostly focused on oil and gas. And so what's your take on all of that change? Even before we got hit by COVID, there was so many, the world's financial minds not looking to invest in oil and gas so much anymore. What do you think, what sticks out to you as some of the big changes and how we can respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think obviously COVID has kind of thrown everyone, I think for a loop might be an understatement, but it has changed everything. It's a defining moment in our generation's time. I have a 5-year-old who now defines his concept of time of whether or not it was before COVID or after COVID. Mommy, did that happen before COVID or is that after COVID?
I think that's smart. Yeah. I do the same thing.
Yeah. So I think in reference to the Alberta Narratives Project, what strikes me is really how relevant some of the key findings that we had in that time are still. Two of the kind of key findings or recommendations were the importance of diversification and needing to talk about diversification, and then also the need to talk about preparation. And so I think if we were to look at COVID and the similarities between climate and COVID, there are quite a few. And we can talk a little bit about that from a communications point of view. But I think broad scale, or kind of broadly, things have changed, but, within the climate movement, we've been talking about the need for change for a long time. So I think the work that we did was, it is kind of relevant now.
Yeah, I think it's very relevant now. I'm wondering, going through it and looking at it, I feel like I don't know if it's a 2.0 that's needed or just an addendum, but it's like, when you think about since that time that got released in February of 2019, that was sort of before even Greta Thunberg sort of really took off. And, so all of those things, do you feel like maybe there needs to be a 2.0 or an addendum or something like that? Or
Yeah, yes and no. Sadly, the other part of that is how little has changed in terms of actual climate action. and movement towards emissions reduction. And you know, on the one hand, we have a lot of really intelligent people who are working really hard. On the other, things are not happening fast enough, particularly, you know, within the context of this province. So, you know, kind of thinking about COVID and climate and, you know, what's the same and what's different, you know, we have a problem that is global, but also local. You know, it's an emergency or a crisis. In some ways it's dependent, or our response is dependent on the trust that we have in both public leaders as well as science, you know, that underpins it. And also, you know, it's exponentially problematic, and it also requires, you know, some of the solutions are, you know, around preparedness, collective action are also similar. So, you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, between the two that we can learn from in how leaders have approached it, you know, and the big difference though, of course, is the time scale, or, you know, our concept of personal relevance. And so I think for people within the climate movement, a part of what, you know, I think a part of the opportunity for us is to kind of really lean into and try to kind of understand what really worked in you know, from a communications point of view for COVID, but then what's so different that, you know, needs a fresh and new approach. So you know, I think on the one hand, yes, the times have changed, you know, from the Alberta Narratives Project, but, you know, really fundamentally, they haven't. You know, we still need to have a critical mass of Albertans or Canadians that support climate action. And unfortunately, you know, while there's kind of latent support, you know, all of the polling would show that people, you know, are concerned about it and consider it a problem. We still aren't, you know, in a situation in which we have actual energy transition.
Right.
Yeah.
So, do you think, like, given that the report really does an incredible thing by going to the different communities, so business communities, oil and gas workers, environmentalists, etc., rural. Are there some communities you think that may have the conversation may have shifted for them more than others? I'm thinking about rural communities, and I'm thinking about farming specifically. It seems like, again, since just even February 20 of 19, they've got hit routinely by so many different weather things, and you know, even just this summer, that the crazy hailstorm, it was like 6 times that month or something like that. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like some of those communities might have shifted more than others that you could guess?
Yeah. You know, I think it would be interesting, you know, on the one hand, well, I think the crux of it is what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we're talking to, you know, different communities? If you go into a rural community or into a group of farmers and you want to talk about the weather and the changes in their personal experience of it, that is a very different conversation than if you're talking about carbon tax or
Right.
you're talking about climate change. And so I think within the Alberta Narratives Project, a part of what the recommendations, you know, that came out of that, and I think that they hold, is inviting, you know, people into a conversation based on what they care about. And unfortunately, we're still in a situation in which you know, climate change is a polarizing, you know, issue for many groups. That said, you know, there's a lot of interesting work that's happening here. You know, members, I think, of the climate, you know, of the Climate Hub, who are very active, you know, in talking with farmers, who, you know, in talking about renewable energy. You know, there's a lot of values alignment between, you know, just to back up, but I think one of the things that struck me the most about the Alberta Narratives Project is that in the perspectives of environmentalists were actually not all that different than the perspectives of farmers. And so we tend to think of farmers, or rural Albertans as being dramatically, different. But in many ways, the concepts and the values were the same. It was the identity and the language that was different. And so, the need to talk about preparedness, to talk about adaptation, to talk about the role of farmers around food security. There are very important issues in which we as a province need to, have that conversation as a community. And I think for farmers in particular, there was a sense at that time, and I think it stands now, where they felt under, they felt that they had an important job to do, and that there was a real opportunity for a future Alberta in which agriculture played a big role in that. So, again, I think it comes back to what conversation are you having, and how do we make it practical, and how do we address people's legitimate concerns, and I think, that's a great example.
So that sort of touches on what my next question is, just the best way to engage different parties or stakeholders on climate. And, I think that you've touched on that a little bit, but maybe there's some more you want to say on that?
How to engage different parties. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I sat through kind of two interesting webinars this week. One was from the Learning for Sustainable Futures that had just published a national survey on climate and climate change education. And they looked at both kind of general public as well as youth and educators. And, for the doesn't matter what poll you look at or what survey you look at, Albertans trail behind the rest of the country in terms of their knowledge and understanding of climate change, their support and perceptions of risk, support for action. So I think that within the context of Alberta, we always have to kind of situate our conversation in the sense of there are different not everybody is the same. People are very different. And so we have our kind of progressive bubble here, but we also have a libertarian bubble, and we have a conservative bubble, and we have a youth bubble. And some of those groups all, share kind of similarities to other places, within the country. But the fact that we're an oil and gas province really has a defining influence on the conversation. And a lot of that goes down to our sense of security and our sense of stability, our sense of belief in the future, our attachment to the good quality of life that we have here. So I think that, if you look at the Alberta Narratives Project, there were kind of some kind of commonalities that that you could apply across the board. And then there were some specific recommendations for each one of these groups, and kind of across the board, this sense of needing to address the instability of an oil and gas or single resource economy came up consistently. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly right now, for a conversation about diversification. So there's that piece. And then also around preparedness. How are we preparing for large shocks, whether they be natural disasters, whether they be pandemics, or the crash of the oil and gas economy, et cetera. So, I think the real point is, on the one hand, we have common values, but on the other hand, we need to understand what are the concerns, what are people thinking about at night, what's keeping them up at night, what are they worried about, and how do we understand that so that we can legitimately and authentically have a conversation with people. People have a very low tolerance for being convinced. They don't want to be convinced about anything. What they want is to have an authentic conversation about something, about climate, or about all of the kind of various pieces that relate to it.
So, okay. So specifically, trying to address climate during COVID, that's something that I end up probably doing poorly just generally, say at the Thanksgiving dinner table, where, I generally I can get my temper up and all of that, and we can end up being in those sorts of conversations. In COVID, I feel like it's a time where there are so many teachable moments, but there's also pitfalls where we can end up pushing away some of those communities that we're trying to bring on board with climate. What sort of pitfalls can we look to avoid if we're trying to convince people to specifically to have the climate conversation during COVID and to try to make those connections?
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of brilliant thinkers who are unpacking this. I think within an Alberta context, it really goes back to empathy. We are in a recession. There are people who are really struggling, as they are everywhere, but on multiple levels. And I think that on the one hand, we can't drop the conversation, but we also have to understand where, what capacity do people have to engage in a conversation, and also what are the pieces that relate to both. When we talk about, and I know that, we may talk about this a bit more, but building back better, and what does that mean, and what does that mean for whom? And I think, Daniel Smith recently published an op-ed, and I think that you'll see that gain traction. That there are, if you lightly scratch the surface, building back better has a lot of similarities, and smartly so, to some of the big policy pushes that were being advocated for from the climate movement for a long time.
Sure, yeah.
And so I think that, the pitfall, really, I think that we ignore at our peril, is the real insecurity. And what does it mean for people within the oil and gas industry, building back better, the climate movement, etc. That's, in the absence of something that is practical and fleshed out in an actual plan of how they will be supported, or what that looks like, we're going to have a very difficult time having a conversation with people.
And it feels to me that this is a conversation that we're not going to be able to avoid. I mean, between Joe Biden running for president, he's talking Build Back Better. The Trudeau government is about to come back. When they come back from prorogation, they're going to present a plan. They're talking about Build Back Better. And it feels like, so that them coming back and them having that means that's going to be a part of the dialogue in Canada, and part of what if there's a next election that's going to be there. So I think you started to talk a little bit about, one of the pitfalls we can avoid is having something solid that we're able to present to people so that they understand what the Build Back Better means for them. Is that a fair encapsulation of what you've said?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's two things. One, don't underestimate, don't underestimate how quickly language will turn.
Yeah.
Right. Build Back Better is a nice framing, but it will quickly devolve into, a conversation about, the attack on the oil and gas industry.
Right.
And that's already happening. So I think it's a solid framing, but it will meet resistance quickly. So I think there's one is, don't put too much stock in language and framing.
Right.
You need some guts behind it. You need an actual plan and something that's practical that people can see themselves in, and that reflects, their concerns, and that they have had a part of building. It's not going to work if we if one side of the table builds out a plan for the other side, it doesn't, we're in it together. Literally, we are all in this together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that COVID, to kind of pull back, is a brilliant example of this kind of, I think within climate and in COVID, you have these two deep narratives that are playing out. One is the collective good, in which much climate action has sits within, and then the other is personal freedom. And so you have whether it's separation, whether it's anti-masking, whether it's no to carbon tax, this kind of fear of government intervention and personal freedom is deep in its place, and it's deep in Alberta, and I think that we also ignore that at our peril. So on the one hand, we have this kind of a deep narrative around, collective action in which we can learn from. But as soon as you talk about personal freedom, the kind of the key characteristics around undermining science, around making out, government intervention to be, bad and uncalled for or unnecessary. I think that the status quo is going to, will push back, as well, as it will in any kind of, big change. And so part of what is helpful in that is to have something that's both acknowledges people's concerns, legitimately, and then also that's practical and is honest. It's like, we don't know, like, we don't have all the answers, and we also can't do it all alone. So something that's kind of empathetic and honest, practical, these are all pieces that will be important in talking about climate change at any time, but particularly, I think, during COVID.
One of the things that going through the report, I feel like, for me as a climate advocate, I have a sense of real urgency. In the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their report in 2018 was talking about limiting warming at 1.5 degrees by 2030. You talk to most scientists these days, that's no longer possible. It's 2 degrees now. And I'm wondering if it's easier now to talk about urgency after everything that's happened since 2019 as it relates to Alberta's economy based so heavily on oil and gas, and so many people having lost their jobs and all of that. Like, is it going to be easier for us to communicate urgency to folks that a lot of them want to say, it's all going to be the same 30 years from now or 50 years from now? Do you think urgency is something we're able to convey easier now?
Yeah. I mean, I think that COVID provides a really excellent, mental model or concept for how we can talk about climate change. And I referenced a few of those pieces that are similar, around it's an exponential problem, it's collective, it's global, it's individual, et cetera. I think one of the brilliant pieces that has also been relieved is the interdependence and the fragility of the systems that we live within. All of that is good, but at the same time, you have a real fundamental lack of knowledge about what climate change is, particularly in this province. So I think, in the study that I referenced from Learning for Sustainable Futures, which was the first of its kind, national, very, prestigious study, Albertans, got 3 to 4 out of 10 questions right, like fundamental climate literacy questions. So you have the lack of literacy around what is climate change is difficult when you're both trying to unpack the urgency and the relevance, and also what are the appropriate solutions that we're advocating for or talking about. So I think there are pieces and even the visuals around, the curve and flattening the curve, like preparedness, exponential growth. Like there's a lot of, I think, building blocks that we can learn from or that we can take. But at the same time, part of this is going to be around the fundamental literacy around what is climate change, what are emissions, and what are appropriate solutions that we're talking about. Because currently, climate change is framed as a progressive ideology, political.
Even a religion, yeah.
Yeah, religion, it's political, it's ideological, and it has moved away from science.
Do you think that, let me see, I know in some areas and amongst some communities, you just end up respecting science more during the COVID era. We're all sort of waiting on, well, some of us are waiting for when a vaccine becomes available. Do you think there's some communities that maybe are shifting in that perspective, or do you think the overlap of folks that tend to not believe in climate science may not, maybe less inclined to believe what the scientists are saying about COVID?
Yeah, and I'm sure that somebody is researching that as we speak. And so I would say that what I'm about to say is complete, is my opinion.
You're allowed to throw darts on this show.
Okay. So I think that the libertarian kind of fundamental value of personal freedom that underpins, anti-vaccination, anti-masking, climate denialism, pick any one of them, that is really, that manifests in this, resistance to government intervention is, I think, very, it's the same, it's because it comes down to values. And so values are persistent, and they are really set within early within our kind of development of who we are. And they're difficult to change. And so, climate change and climate action is systemic, and it is large. And I think one of the brilliance, out of a difficult situation of the past 6 or 7 months is really what is possible when needed,
right?
And how quickly can change happen systemically when needed. And what is the role of public leadership within that? And what is the role of government? And how does that become, and what makes it possible? So I think that, the resistance to, or the kind of the attack that we see on science is really, underneath of that is a skepticism around any sort of erosion of personal freedom, personal choice, and government intervention. That's really, I think, the similarities between the resistance between the two, and I think something that far more than this sense of conservatism is really the movement within Alberta around personal freedom.
Yeah, I feel like there's a few things that I don't think it's uniform across communities about what happens with science. I think in some cases, it's the old saw about you tend not to believe things that can affect your livelihood on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's been a concentrated effort to erode expertise and scientific knowledge from not from your ground level people, but from folks that are being manipulative and trying to gain power through that route. And so yeah, I my feeling is that it's not going to be uniform across those populations, but I think there'll be some that might move and be more open to it. Well, I guess we'll have to see. Is it, do you think it's effective? I'll just tell you personally, when there was a couple of years in a row where there was a lot of smoke, I remember this one particular time I had traveled up to Edmonton, and I show up at a backyard barbecue. I know everybody there. I'm the bull goose loony lefty, and I've had climate debates with all of them, and they know they can work out their climate frustrations versus me if they want to. And it's a thing where it was like a bright orange sky, one of those smoky bright orange skies that and I'm saying to them, well, this is it, guys. Look, it's the sky. Like, how are you going to miss it now? And that a hotter planet equals a longer dry season equals the more likelihood the whole thing's going to go up in flames, and that it's going to be a bigger fire. Is that something that does drawing attention to it help? I mean, right now, I feel like if I were in that debate again, I'd say, okay, guys, you got a Category 4 hitting Texas and Louisiana, Category 4 hurricane. California's on fire for the 4th year in a row or whatever it is. And, it'll just as likely be Australia again 6 months from now and whomever else. And is there value in drawing attention to the real world climate things, or am I just going to end up going down the dark hole where they're like, it's not related to climate?
Well, there's just so much to say about this.
I know. Well, that's a show. So,
I mean, I think some great research was done by two researchers called Eric LaChapelle out of the University of Montreal and Louise Comeau earlier last year. And one of the key findings of that is that by and large, Canadians are making sense of climate change by, experiences of extreme weather. So for the most part, even within Alberta, there's a lot of resonance with a sense of things are different now. They're not the same as they were before. It's not normal. The rains that we're seeing, or the drought, or the fires, or the hurricanes, or the extreme weather. There's a lot of resonance around that. To go back to the literacy part, what is the connection between climate change and extreme weather is weak, but even more so is the leap required to get from extreme weather to many of the dominant solutions that we talk about. A carbon tax. What is the relationship between a carbon tax and extreme weather? And part of that is also the trust required of the people who are leading on those solutions, and the trust required, and the belief that I pay tax, and that will go to address a problem that is both local and national and global. So I think that talking about extreme weather is really important, but it's also important, I think, for us as people who think about and understand this, of going one step further and drawing out in simple examples, or in ways that draws a relationship to what's the relationship between climate change and rains or fires, et cetera. So part of that is around, I think, the education, and then I think the piece with solutions and the trust is really around expanding the engagement and expanding the tent of the types of people who are talking about this, and the types of leadership that we can see advocating for different solutions.
Okay. So I'm going to borrow some of your communications, your extensive communications knowledge. And I'm taking away with me that what you said about how fluid language can be and how quickly it can turn. So I have been talking with folks here in Alberta about some of the many different things we could be switching to. We want to use diversification instead of transition, if I'm following the Alberta Narratives plan, was my understanding.
Yeah, it
but
depends on who you're talking to. Yeah.
right, yeah, okay.
Mhm.
Um, the phrase that we started using was an Alberta New Deal
Mhm.
because, I get that green has now become a bad word, and fair enough. And I feel like, left, right, or center, almost everybody feels like we need a New Deal. So we could almost trick people into, coming on board to that. Of the different sort of phrases that are coming up, a just transition, build back better, an Alberta New Deal. What are there some that are more likely, you think, to have legs?
Yeah. I I think an Alberta New Deal is a very interesting. I think that's very interesting. I think we should talk about transition for a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah.
You know, a political scientist or a political scientist at the University of Calgary, dug a little bit deeper into the what transition means, based out of the Alberta, Narratives Project, and a part of this is really, if you sit within the bubbles already, transition is, for people who sit kind of within the, who are not involved in the oil and gas industry, who may hold, more progressive values. Transition was a good word. It was, evocative.
Mhm.
I think that, for people who work within the oil and gas industry, again, it goes back to transitioning to what and who is transitioning me.
Right.
It is the skepticism around, what, and underneath of that is this need for a sense of security and stability. So on the one hand, we might all be able to understand, and I think that there is a real sense of the need for diversification within the economy. Transition is a tricky word because it means different things for different people.
Mhm.
And particularly if we're able to understand and put ourselves in the shoes of some of the most important, audiences, transition is not, it's scary in some ways. It's like, who's
Mhm.
transitioning and where am I going?
Right.
So I think like transition, and then the word just, similarly, within progressive circles, we understand what just means. If I literally were to say to my father, address just transition, he'd be like, just what? Like,
Right.
like what
Yeah.
are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right?
Fair enough.
So,
Yep.
and then if, once you unpack, like, it means justice, justice, means different things for different people.
Right.
And it's not a centering or a core value in which that they hold dear. So, I think, for many audiences, and we can talk a little bit about who we're leaving out when we think about our allies.
Mhm.
There's some really interesting conversations around why are we so focused on conservatives, versus, other people who we have a lot of alignment around, equality and justice. But that's maybe a different conversation. So I think, I think, just transition is a very, it is very much within a progressive bubble, and it has very different connotations outside of it. So if we're talking internally, and we're mobilizing our bases, it's a great word. If
Mhm.
we are trying to engage outside of that, I think it is extremely tricky language,
Mhm.
and will mean different things and may alienate. And it's like one of those like little, flags for people. It's like a little dog whistle. Oh yeah, just transition. Like it's those progressive types.
Right.
And so I think if we were to go back to, really understanding, and this goes to the importance of the right messenger. If people are having this conversation within their own communities, they're naturally going to use, the appropriate language that is meaningful to the people that they're talking to. We talk about just transition because it is meaningful to us.
Mhm.
I can tell you that farmers are not sitting around a table talking about just transition,
Right.
right? But if you are within a labor union, you're in the progressive movement, you might very well be talking about that. Diversification, is in many ways a code word for energy transition within our province. And I think the other piece that goes part and parcel to that is there's a lot of openness to renewable energy. Let's just not talk, which is kind of one of the key pieces that Melanie Thompson was looking at the UC. If we're talking about energy transition, in addition to the status quo of oil and gas, there's a lot of support for it. If we're talking about energy transition as a moving away from oil and gas, there's less support. So opening up and talking about diversification when it includes energy diversification, I think there's a real opportunity to have a strong conversation. And Build Back Better, I think, is in some ways meaningful, and I think it'll be really interesting to see the kind of pushback and the way that will be a lightning rod for opposition and what's going to happen with those words.
Mm-hmm. And then do you get any red flags off of an Alberta New Deal? Like, is even just putting New Deal on the end kind of put the kibosh on that as a phrase?
Well, it probably, to be honest, a Green New Deal probably hasn't moved that far outside of progressive circles in many ways. And so more important, I think, is who's talking about it and how practical is the conversation, and what kind of, how well does it reflect the concerns of the people that it's meant to be a solution for. So I think an Alberta New Deal, if being talked about from the UCP, would have a very different reaction than if it was being, talked about from the NDP within our province. So, the search for something that's fresh and that is not already framed is important, but I think language and framing can get you so far. Underneath of that is the need for something that's practical and legitimate and that represents the people that it's meant to engage.
Okay. That's there. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. Okay, so panning back for a second, what do you think organizations like the Calgary Climate Hub can do to help stick the landing on a Build Back Better or a whatever we're deciding to call it? How can we soften that ground somehow? Do you have any ideas on that? It's a tough question, I know. So
no, I think I think there's tremendous opportunity in local action, and a community-based approach allows for a kind of a drawing on the identity of the local community. It allows for something that is less political and less polarized. So, the Calgary Climate Hub and other, hubs across, the country have a real opportunity to work with local politicians or local leaders, and to work at a local scale to test and to try and to innovate and to draw on what we hold dear here. It is the quality of life, it is the natural beauty that we're situated within, it is our sense of innovation, it's also the problems, that are very local, around unemployment and, downtown being empty, etc. So I think that you can just have a really real and authentic and genuine conversation once you get local. And I think that for the Climate Hub, Building Back Better can really be tied to some very practical, relevant things rather than being lost in what is often considered a very elite and theoretical conversation. If we can tie Build Back Better to transportation options, to access to different types of energy, and forward conversations that actually improve our quality of life, and the quality of life of people who are both vulnerable as well as future generations. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. People love Calgary. You know, we're here for a reason. And I think that if we're able to kind of capture the imagination and the vision of why we want to be here, building back better allows us to tie it to both a future, but also to really embed it within something that's practical in now, and what is missing often from the climate solutions conversation or the climate conversation. We tend to have a conversation that is kind of very removed from people's lives. And I think talking about things locally allows us to bring it to scale and to make it personal and relevant, which is, you know, and kind of have a pulse and a feeling and something that's tangible. So I think the opportunity is to make building back better, like tangible and relevant, and, you know, grounded or tethered to what people care about or what matters to people here.
Excellent. I'm going to just say a couple of words about our sponsor there, and then we'll move on to our panelists. We just have a single panelist tonight, but it's a good panelist. To begin with, I'd like to take this moment to recognize the support of the Alberta Ecotrust Foundation for the Calgary Climate Hub and this broadcast, and to let our audience know that Alberta Ecotrust's environmental grant program is still accepting letters of intent for major projects until September 11th of this year. So head over to their website at albertaecotrust.com after the show for more details, or check them out on Facebook and Twitter, the links for which are in the chat. I'll also take this a minute to put a little personal pitch for the Calgary Climate Hub. If you feel, a quote that I quite like from Joan Baez is that the antidote for anxiety is action. And what I can tell you is I've lived it. And it really does lighten your soul to sit around a table with a bunch of smart people and work on bona fide, impactful change. And that's what the Calgary Climate is. That's what we do. So if you want to be a part of something like that, check us out at calgaryclimatehub.ca. We can always use volunteers for a number of great initiatives that we're working on. And we take donations as well. If you don't have any time, but you've got a few bucks, we can use it. Climate is a tough dollar in this province. So consider donating to the Calgary Climate Hub. Okay, so beyond that, this is now our Q&A session. We typically allow our questioners both a question and a follow-up. We'll also continue to take your questions via the Zoom chat. We've got a couple in there that we hope to get to tonight, and from our Facebook Live feed. So post those up. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Our Q&A panelist tonight is Pat Letizia, CEO of the aforementioned Alberta Ecotrust, which I would say played a pivotal role in the Narratives Project. So I'll let Pat come on here, and generally I allow a question and a follow-up, but I feel like if you two incredible ladies want to talk about anything you want, who am I to stop you? Go ahead, take it away, Pat.
Thanks, Steve. I'll put a plug in for the Calgary Climate Hub too. Big supporter, big fan, and Steve Bentley always either makes me laugh or brings a tear to my eye, and he's done both tonight, so we're in good form. Oh, Amber, I was just like writing pages and pages of notes thinking we need a cocktail in about 4 hours as usual. So I'm going to try and talk really fast and set some context for what I'm actually going to ask you, which I think will help really summarize what you've been talking about and maybe answer some of Steve's persistent questioning. So I was really struck by what you said about nobody wants to be convinced, that convincing people is a big pitfall. In my 20 years, actually, what am I saying? Like, I've been at Ecotrust 24 years, and you know, my background is in earth science. I felt urgency around climate change a long time ago, and I have burned many bridges having the urgent, convincing conversation. I know it doesn't work. Unless you've already laid the groundwork for it, right? As you said, when you talk about the orange sky, start asking questions about, are people worried about this? What's driving their fear? What if it keeps happening? I mean, that's the kind of conversation you don't just kind of jump into, this is going to keep happening, you know. So that convincing people pitfall, I thought was really important. I was thinking too, as you were talking, that we really need to think about a systems approach, and we tend to focus on climate change as an environmental or ecosystem problem, but others see it as a big disruption in the economic system, and more we're focusing on the challenges in the social system with climate change. And I also really liked the empathy piece. And then I thought, when we're talking about systems, one of the biggest disruptions we've ever seen in our life is COVID. It has completely disrupted all of our systems, our social and cultural systems, our economic system, our ecosystems. And a system disruption creates room for other interventions. And so what is the room that this disruption is creating? And that made me think about, you talked about the guts, right? And so where's the guts for Build Back Better? Phrases don't work. People don't even understand the taxation system. You start talking about the Alberta New Deal, all they're going to come back with is that's a radical leftist socialist idea. They don't know what it means. They don't know anything about it. They may agree with 15 points in it, but they only hear the frame, and that's it. You're not going to have that conversation. So I keep thinking about who can move in behind these disruptions. Like, is the Calgary Climate Hub and others, are they prepared to kind of move into that space and be really strategic about how do you now hold this space, and who do you need to bring into it? And what also strikes me is that the thing that Canadians care about most, especially now, but even before this, is health. And what I'm going to ultimately get to the question of messenger versus message. And I want to point you guys to Dr. Hinshaw. She's an expert in public health. She understands disease spread. She stands up there. She used to stand up there daily, and now it's still fairly regularly. Calm, measured, knowledgeable. She talks about the science of how disease spreads, but she also talks about how important it is for family, for grandchildren and grandparents. And she tells us the whole story. She paints a picture of our life, and she does it without shrieking, without raising her voice. She gives us a calm sense of we're in good hands. And we listen to her because she's an expert and she's speaking to something that we really care about. Premier Kenney also, even when he's talking about COVID, I thought he did a great job, when this first happened. Of course, we're in trouble financially as a province. We're running out of money. We're probably running out of credit. And so he has to switch to the talk about the economy, but he's still measured, consistent. He doesn't get flapped about something. He may respond, but it's to reinforce his previous point. He rarely gets engaged in someone else's point because he knows what he's doing. And I think too that when you have a really good message and a messenger that you trust, you have a better chance of impact or change. And so, when you look at sorry, I don't want to take too much time because I know people are probably lining up here, but when you think of this spectrum of advocacy, and you have activism at the left, maybe voting on the right. And so, in between, you talked about you use the word we a lot. And I started writing down thinking, we talk about we in our bubble, but we should mean most of us. It should mean people who aren't in this bubble and who aren't in this room or in this conversation. So that's what I mean. When we move into this space, how do we grow the we so that there's momentum and there's consistency? And we don't have the money or the resources that the libertarian fundamental value people have. That has, libertarianism is not new, but it now has, it's well funded. There's something behind it now. The rise of well-funded, organized alt-right communication strategy kind of, vis-a-vis the Karl Rove and that old conservative stuff that started in the US before the Tea Party. That's just pervasive and it's well funded. We, the people, don't have that kind of money. So we need to be really smart. And I think that's why communications and how we talk about these issues are really important. Because for some people, it's about power. It's not about community. It's not about the best thing for everybody, the best thing for the public. It's about holding on to your own stuff, your own power, your own resources. So I want to come back. My question really is around if we could really understand one thing about the message and the messenger, when we're talking to a room full of people or a city full of people who want to do something, how would you summarize that up? Like what would you tell us that is really critical to keep in mind?
Yeah. Well, two things came to mind. So when you opened up talking about being convinced, I think people want to be listened to. They don't want to be convinced. And so I think that's really important as we try to move beyond, the community that we have formed around this, around climate change. We need to listen more than we need to convince in the beginning. So I think, so I would just say that people want to be listened to because they want to be heard, and there's a lot of power in building the empathy required to really understand somebody else's perspective. We need to listen. So I think that that's important. The other piece that's important, and it relates to messenger, and it relates to how quickly we can have a conversation that gets into action and change, is Ariel Deranger, who is the executive director of the Indigenous Climate Action Center, talks that change, moves at the speed of trust. And so we have to trust each other. And a part of trusting each other is that we feel listened to and that we feel cared for. And I think that trust in messengers, what we know poll after poll or, piece after piece, is that environmentalists are really trusted on talking about the environment. Not so much about the economy, not so much about health even. Even doctors are not necessarily trusted in talking about climate scientists. Or climate science. So I think that for us, that there is so much work to be done around, developing the literacy and the understanding of climate and climate science that is really situated well within an environmental frame and what that means. But we need to, I think, work with allies who can much more quickly build the trust that's needed to enter into the conversations that are focused on economics and and other pieces related to social social change, etc. So that would be my answer, is that we should feel a lot of confidence that we are well trusted with an environmental lens, and that there are a lot of allies that we can be working with that can more quickly get to the point than we can. So understanding the limitations of the trust that we have, I think, is important.
Yeah, I would build on that. I agree with you 100%, and I'm going to move actually to Steve's last question about what the Calgary Climate Hub could do. And I think, Steve, 60% of Canadian emissions come from buildings and transportation, and that means most of it's in cities. And in Alberta, 61% of the population lives in Calgary and Edmonton, in the metro regions of Calgary and Edmonton. That means if the Calgary Climate Hub really puts attention to Calgary, and they can reduce like 30% of the province's emissions, that's pretty significant. And I think that one of the things I would say is you need to align with and support local policy that has potential. And that means help the administration get over the bridge to council. And so that policy gets sorry, Amber, am I?
No, and just to build on that, we could like,
Yeah.
but I think a part of this is like, it's all, you know, it all sits within the same bucket is like, where are the opportunities for allyship for groups who are concerned about, you know, energy reduction, whether it's poverty groups or, you know, accessible transportation, or where are the issues that we have common ground and can find allies who are well trusted and bring a whole community of supporters with them. So I think rather than, I think that there's a huge amount of opportunity for allyship and working with other groups in which the solutions themselves have multiple, you know, the actions have multiple solutions to multiple problems.
Yeah, totally agree. And my next point was going to be exactly that. People in the climate movement might not know that the United Way now has a climate change team. Momentum, which is, you know, a large community economic development organization, is focusing on the cost of energy and energy poverty. The Women's Center has done a whole bunch of really amazing work on climate change and climate communications, because the impacts of extreme weather have huge impacts on women. And so there's just so many other NGOs out there, other community groups. And if you think of how we campaign with urgency around an election, and we start thinking, okay, who's going to go talk to the new Canadians? Who's going to talk to women? Who's going to talk to youth? Who's going to get out into the faith community? It's exactly the same kind of organizing strategy. You have to hold that room, that space, that especially now that this disruption has created, and don't necessarily say build back better, but figure out what build back better means, who's going to help get it done, what it's going to look like at the end of the day, what's the picture of better versus before. And there's lots of signals. People are saying they're spending less money, they're enjoying their families better, they're recreating outside more, they're cycling. Those are all things that are related to climate change, consumption, you know, transportation. And so the space is already there, the signals are already there. I just think there's so much opportunity for the Climate Hub.
And this is not my idea, but I think it's a really important strategy, and it relates to what we've just said, is we've spent a tremendous amount of energy trying to convince people that hold very different values that they need to get, that they need to understand the urgency of climate change. I think if we were to redirect that energy instead into developing allyship with people in which there is a common ground around the solutions, it would be much better spent. So I think understanding who our allies are and redirecting our energy is, you know, fundamental, I think, to building power. Power is with the people. That's Kat Abreu with the Climate Action Network, you know, recently, you know, talked about that on a webinar that we hosted. And power is with the people, and we need to find our people, and we need to build that power. But part of that is by really listening and understanding what their concerns are, and moving forward with common ground.
That I wasn't going to let Pat go before I asked her for advice about the hub. So it's always great when the guests anticipate the question. I can just sit here and drink my coffee, which is wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on, Pat. And from a personal level, thanks so much for what you do and for what Alberta Ecotrust does.
Hear.
It's so critical to the climate movement in this province. It means the world. So thank you for the great work that you do.
And I would also say that one of the best resources that we have in Calgary to make the Climate Hub get somewhere, you know, or keep getting somewhere, is Amber Bennett. Mm-hmm. The Amber is, I don't think people, you know, all always know that Amber is probably one of the preeminent climate communications experts in Canada. And it started, you know, well, with her interest, you know, she did a lot of work before she came to the Narratives Project, but yeah, she steered that narrative ship project very, very skillfully, and the work that she's done since is just phenomenal. And so you know what,
I'll take the opportunity to make Amber blush a little bit as well. Once we started taking her on for the community climate conversations, I told her, I will take you for any one of these events that we have from here to eternity, because the message is critical and you're great at delivering it. So
Thank you very much.
you bet. Okay, so thank you again, Pat. I'm going to move on to we've got a question or two here, and then we'll let Amber off the hook. I have a really good question here from James Sterling. And it kind of reminds me of what Climate Reality Project does, this question, but it's just, does the Alberta Narratives have an organization doing training for facilitators of discussions around climate transition? Because certainly for Climate Reality Project, they train up experts, and then those experts are able to make the case on climate. And I think James has got an excellent question there.
Yeah. The short answer is no. It is it was a citizen social science research project, and I think that it was unique in that way. There's not a lot of those. They're often kind of science rather than social science. That said, I think that there is interest in I think that some of the groups that were involved with the Alberta Narratives Project are interested in having exactly that conversation. What does energy transition look like within Alberta and within the community? And to use a similar model, which is to say that it's community-based, that it is facilitators who are drawn from the community in which they're hosting the conversation, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of power in the model itself, for various reasons, and I think that, James, you should reach out, because I'm not sure how quickly it may come to fruition, but what I would say is that there is interest in having hosting a similar project within Alberta that is focused on energy transition. It's just not happening quite yet.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Let's see, I saw another one here. Robert Tremblay, do you find, he's asking, but do you have any advice how to talk about climate change versus weather? And I noticed the term weather comes up in the narratives download a few times. And I get, is that so? Do you advise using the term weather instead of climate change for some populations, or?
I think that I think there's 2 points to keep in mind. One, climate change is I think the term is dog whistle, but climate can be immediately a good way to stop a conversation in Alberta. It has become quite polarized, and so while the scientists in us, or in understanding the difference between climate and weather, is important, and it's an important distinction to make, entering into the conversation through talking about weather and changes in weather, and really, I think, listening to the person that you're having the conversation with, really inviting them to talk about, their own personal experiences and how it might be different, and are they worried about it and concerned about it, is really a very, I think, open and authentic way to start a conversation. Then at some point, and I think we're in each conversation you can gauge where you are. I think that there is a way, a place or a spot to transition into what is the relationship between weather and climate change. But I think we, for the most part, if we're concerned about talking about climate change, talking about weather is a great place to start. And I think listening to people's personal experiences, and then asking them, and kind of gauging and asking them about levels of concern, and then moving into the relationship between weather and climate is something that you could test and try.
Excellent. Okay, that's just about it for this week's Climate of Change. I want to make sure before I take off, is there anything else you'd like to communicate with our audience tonight, Amber, or do we hit all the notes?
No, I mean, I think that, one of the single most important things that we can do is talk about it, really.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't really matter where you are. I think talking about it and talking about concern, talking about your own personal story and what it means to you, and talking and listening is a very important place to start right now. And also, if you have, and anyone can do that, it helps. There's so many reasons why that's important. But then I think also building and getting involved locally with the Climate Hub is a really important way to build momentum and to build a sense of community, and to also expand our sense of all of those, everyone's perspective is important, and something meaningful to contribute. So that would be my two things. Go have a conversation about it. And if you have time, join a community of people who are working on it.
Excellent. Amber, thank you so much for coming on tonight and for the great and important work you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. I loved it.
Great. Okay, so if you liked this Climate of Change episode, I thought we had included the links in the chat. I'm not sure if I see them there, and if not, it's most likely my fault. But we will be posting links for all the episodes of the previous season on the Facebook Live and via Twitter. So feel free to check that out. There's still some conversation going on right now about this episode on Facebook. I don't know if you have a Facebook account, Amber, or not, but
I do. It contains a lot of pictures of my dog and my children, though.
maybe some meals too. That's how it's like kids, dogs, and plates of food is what I see happen a lot from some folks. Okay, well, if you felt like coming in and checking out the conversation there, you're perfectly welcome to. And there's some folks that are asking questions about this episode. You feel free to, again, for everybody to go and check out those previous episodes in the first season. I'll mention again the Calgary Climate Hub, that we're looking for donors and we're looking for membership. We are going to reboot or kick off again this fall our community climate conversations. We're of course going to be doing a digital version, but stay tuned to find out more information about the when, the where, and the what. Thanks again to Alberta Ecotrust for helping us make this show a reality, and thanks to Pat for coming on. And I'll also thank our volunteers, my producers Shay, Joan, and Pamela do a lot of great work keeping me moving in the straight line that I need to, and my friend Paul, who helps me out with the sound. Good night for now, and let's get to work. Thanks, Amber.
Thank you so much.